Good evening and welcome to the Pompey Politics Podcast.
I'm Ian Tiny Morris.
And I'm Simon Sansbury.
All the leaves are brown and the sky is grey, as somebody once intoned. Welcome to the autumn series of the Pompey Politics podcast. We had a little bit of a false start at the end of the summer, but we are now back for good, to steal another song reference. How are you, Simon?
I'm all right. I'm just glad that we didn't. Who was that? Was that Backstreet Boys? And we'll be back for good. No, that was. Was he
That was
17?
Take That.
Take that. Well, take that. I didn't remember that. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I'm doing okay. How was your week? What are we doing today?
Yeah, marvellous. Well, we're back on today, and as the title suggests, we are charging forward, but perhaps more slowly. And great work with the logo of the EV charger and the snail. I'm sure that was a children's book. I may have read at some point, but who knows? Things get more confused as time goes on.
It might
Um,
be.
it could do. So yeah. Everyone's favourite unelected Prime Minister, Mr. Rishi Sunak, has caught the headlines in the last couple of weeks with a series of announcements relating to some of the acceleration towards carbon neutral that had been, oh God, even I look now, by his predecessor's predecessor. The predecessor minus one wasn't here for very long. So today we thought we'd have a look at what exactly had been said and some of the rationale behind it, and then pick through the bones as to pragmatic decision, or is there more behind the thinking of why we should be rowing back?
Yeah. So just in case anybody had been sleeping in a garden shed. So last week, the PM made an announcement, effectively, while sticking to the 2050 net zero goal, has rolled back by 5 years the banning of sales of new internal combustion engine vehicles. So new cars that are powered by petrol or diesel, and also delayed the ban on new gas boilers. Making both of those 2035, but stating that didn't constitute any diminishing of the aim to get to net zero by 2050. The PM made various sorts of claims, but essentially that was the point, that was their announcement, which came a couple of days after Liz Truss, if you can remember who she was, basically got up and said that effectively we should row back on a lot of this green stuff, and repeated the ever so successful things from last summer's mini budget about a low tax economy. It's almost like there was a Conservative Party conference coming up or something.
Well, and I think that's where we've got to, and we'll go into the detail, but we have got to pick the bones out of this in terms of how
Mm.
much of this is good sense, how much of it makes sense, and how much of it is the pre-appetizer for an upcoming election. So I think we've got our suspicions that when Liz stood up and said her piece, it's one of those things where when you see Liz making a speech, you kind of think, well, I guess it's natural that people should listen to an ex-prime minister, but an ex-prime minister that perhaps didn't do the full shift. I am, and let's suggest that her, was it 46 days?
Was it 49 or 47?
Oh, well,
It was under 50.
we'll call it 50 for cash. We're not perhaps the most successful period in prime ministerial history. So yeah, interesting that she should be looking to set the agenda and perhaps or try and influence the agenda from, shall we say, the more radical side of the Conservative Party. So I think in the style of Chris Whitty, you might have the slides there that
I
that the PM used to explain show his working out.
I do indeed. So I've got some slides. So for those listening to the podcast, I will attach them. I will attach the link to them, so that you can follow along at home, as it were. But those of you watching the stream, or watching it back on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, Twitch, where else? Anywhere else? Can't think
I
of
think
anywhere
that's
else.
all. Yeah.
So yes, please do like, follow, subscribe, send cake, basically. But yes, I have some slides. So so the PM kind of started his speech saying that this wasn't going to impact our ability to deliver net zero. So interesting that he made that statement at the outset. I think because that would probably have been the first thing that that people would have been concerned about. But the first slide was saying that the UK has reduced emissions faster than any other major economy. That graph basically was showing a comparison between 1990 and the 2020 Climate Watch figures that are available online, and I'll share the link to those in the comments. But essentially, the rest of the G7, the average for them was -8%, but there will be some countries that have delivered more than that. They're obviously impinged by some of the not so proactive countries, but the UK has indeed, compared to 1990, reduced its emissions by 48%. So that does mean that we've done quite well, done very well, really, to reduce them by nearly 50%. But that does mean that we're still adding greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. That doesn't mean that we're still contributing to global warming. So just to kind of set the parameters of net zero is about the point at which you stop making it worse.
Yes, and I think that's where again, there's always lies, damn lies, and then there are statistics, aren't there? Which is that we've done 48%, and the average for the other seven is 8%. And again, you kind of look at that and think, well, it is an interesting way of looking at it, because the other G7, in terms of their emissions, not all animals are equal in that seven. And if some of the smaller contributors have made really big strides, but some of the bigger contributors perhaps haven't made such good strides, that brings the average as a whole down. So, as with all statistics, and I know I don't have to explain this to you as a Liberal Democrat and producer of bar charts, sometimes
I claim no ownership of any bar
no,
charts
no,
produced.
no, but sometimes you choose your statistics to make you look good. But I think
How dare you?
I think it would be fair to say that all parties do that. The 48% halving in 30 years is a great leap forward, and it's better than the average. So, and I think it's fair to say is that Climate Watch are independent and are not a government think tank, so
No,
we can trust their stats to be good and honest. So, haven't we done well so far? As his opening slide.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the next slide is basically the UK's share of global emissions has fallen below 1%, which is indeed true. But for the 2020 figures, the UK is at 0.87% of the contributors to global greenhouse gases. So that is indeed correct. We're 22nd of 198 countries in the contributors to that. So that still puts us in the way up in the top 20, as in worst 20, you might say. But there's other stuff that goes like, obviously countries are of varying sizes, but also there are varying sizes of population, but also of varying sizes of actual contribution to the problem. But yes, in a sense, we are less than 1% of our contribution to the increase in greenhouse gases is less than 1% of the global total. Yes, true.
Yep. So another solid statistic that is, we are doing nicely. Thank you.
Yeah. The next one, the UK committed to reducing emissions faster than every other major economy. It's interesting that, it's interesting that the phrasing there, that we committed to reducing emissions. It's not we have, or we did, or we will. It's we've committed. So it's almost like we were the fastest at saying that we were going to reduce them by what, and it doesn't talk about the amount and by when. So I don't know. It's a strange choice of sentence. But the other thing there that's interesting is that other major economies, but in this bar chart, we're being compared to Germany, France, Australia, USA, Japan, Russia, New Zealand, Canada, and the EU, which of
Hmm.
course also includes Germany and France. But bless them, I would never have thought that New Zealand was a major economy.
No, and again, a little bit selective, isn't it? In terms of you pick your sample that makes you look best. You look at some. There's New Zealand on the list. I don't see one for. I would rather have seen perhaps India and Brazil on that graph. But maybe those numbers didn't. So again, better than some other major players. Better perhaps than some minor players. But again,
Yeah,
it's starting to look a little bit more. Shall I use the phrase statistically selective?
yeah, they've definitely chosen the comparison, and interestingly, this one that they quote their source as internal Department for Energy Security and Net Zero calculations. Um,
Ah, well,
so
could be that could be the net zero calculation. Somebody could have got the NZ muddled up, and that's why New Zealand are
and
on
that's why
there.
New Zealand are there.
Yeah,
Indeed, that could entirely be it.
yeah, yeah.
So,
So
so
somebody said to make sure you include NZC, and somebody, well, oh, New Zealand country, I better stick that on the graph. Yeah, I think that's what happened.
definitely. So the next slide was about the UK set to have one of the lowest emissions per capita of any major economy. So in this one, the UK is shown as interestingly the vertical axis on this one. The scale has got some numbers from 0 to 14, but it doesn't say what they're measuring. It shows the UK in lovely, almost rainbow colours nearest the axis, but then basically everyone else kind of after that in increasing levels of whatever the bars are meant to be. But we're being in this one compared to Brazil, the EU, Japan, Argentina, China, USA, Canada, and Australia. Um, I don't know that we. I mean, Brazil's the 11th country in the world by GDP. We're the sixth. So, what are you when you're saying a major economy? I don't know that that those would be the ones that you'd pick necessarily. I mean,
Well,
obviously the USA and Canada. The USA is currently the world's largest economy. Sorry, China is the second largest. Um, but yeah, Australia is the 12th. Canada is the ninth. Argentina, where are Argentina? They're the 22nd largest economy in the world by GDP.
mm,
So
yeah, and they seem the odd one to sort of throw into the mix. And I think that this is where some of these things, when you start to look at them, and when you look at things like per capita, and the UK is a pretty densely populated country on the whole. There are big bits of it that perhaps aren't so much. But when you look at you try doing that comparison with somewhere like, you know, India or Russia, um, not the same. And but then the flip side to that is, particularly in somewhere like India, you know, living standards in big cities very similar to a Western economy, but great swathes of the country, um, possibly, you know, different expectations and different levels of pollution. So, or of carbon, of carbon emissions. So, I think these, again, they're looking to paint a good story to set up the reveal, aren't they?
they are. So I mean, again, this is saying per capita of any major economy. So I compared the GDP figures against the 2020 figures from Climate Watch per capita. And actually, of the top 25 countries by GDP, the UK the UK's emissions per capita of the 25, there are actually 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. There were 10 that have actually got a lower emissions per capita than we have. One of whom, India, is actually a larger economy than ours. They're
Yep.
fifth in GDP. France, which is just behind us, is seventh in GDP. Also, so yeah, even in the top 10, there are three other countries in the top 10 that have by GDP that have actually lower emissions per capita. So that's obviously the 2020 figures, which was the latest set of figures actually on Climate Watch. But it's also interesting that the statement here is UK set to have one of the lowest emissions per capita of any major economy. Well,
Again,
set to is
yeah,
you
it's
know
another forward-looking statement, and I think the
yeah
2020 data is clearly showing us that you know the UK is kind of above the midpoint in the top half of the table, but not pushing
no.
for medal places at this point. But
No, not by a long shot, not by capita. And also it's a bit like saying my budget is lower than your budget. Well, your budget's saying how low your budget is compared to someone else's, even if that were the case, is one thing. But it's actually really how much you spend, right?
correct. Next slide.
So the last slide people will be glad to hear before this turns into death by PowerPoint. So the last slide is basically the UK's new transition to EVs is in line with other major countries. So their choice of word, countries. So our old goal was 2030. The likes of Norway, Denmark, Iceland, and Singapore are going for 2030, whereas the 2035 is now obviously the UK. They've put a nice red circle around that just to help us in case we weren't sure what country we're in. But also France, Germany, Sweden, Spain, California, Canada, New York, Massachusetts, and Queensland, Australia. I don't know, how good's your geography?
Well, it's good enough to know that some of those places are not countries.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that 2030 list. Again, the three Nordic countries and Singapore, and without wishing to bore the listeners, I member of my team went to live in Singapore and realised that before you can own a car in Singapore, you first have to purchase a license to own a car, and that those come up for auction periodically. So you've got to put about £50,000 down to buy one of the licenses. And bear in mind, this was probably 10 years ago. And once you've got the license, then you can go and buy a car. So there is an element of, because Singapore is an extremely small island, lots of people go there, but it's tax advantageous nature. So it doesn't surprise me that they are the part of their challenge in terms of EVs will not be, oh, EVs are slightly more expensive than petrol cars, because when you've got to put down a significant sum on the table just to be able to purchase one, I don't think that's going to be a problem for them. So I guess we didn't spell it out, but this slide does, is that so that deadline for the end of the sale of new petrol and diesel combustion engines has now gone back 5 years,
Yeah.
from 2030 to 2035. So should we focus in on the EV thing first,
Okay.
in terms of bad thing, good thing, too soon to tell,
Well,
surprised?
here's the thing is that and it's worth saying that different people responded to it in a variety of ways, to be fair. So it wasn't either universally championed or derided. So the Labour Shadow Environment Secretary, Steve Reed, basically said that Rishi had sold out the biggest economic opportunity of the 21st century, and that would cause the UK to miss its net zero target. Lib Dem leader Sir Ed Davey called it selfish, and it epitomises his weakness. The Scotland's First Minister, Humza Yousaf, called it utterly unforgivable. Even Chris Stark, the chief executive of the UK's Independent Climate Change Committee, wasn't exactly glowing, and basically said that they'd already advised the government that we weren't on track actually to meet the 2030 emission targets. So that's the milestone to actually deal with the emission targets towards 2050. On the other, coming out in with their cheering pom poms, raising instead of their booing, Jacob Rees-Mogg basically seemed to think that it was a great idea, and that having regulations coming in so quickly isn't a great thing, and that moving to something he called intelligent net zero. I don't know how something can be an intelligent. Not me funny. It's either net zero or it isn't. I don't know what caveat he's trying to introduce there. It gives me shivers about the whole thing about lukewarm Brexit, cold Brexit. Yeah, net zero is net zero, right? It's just maths.
Yeah.
And even Sir Alex Sharma, who was the Conservative minister who chaired the COP26 climate summit, in which a lot of the original targets were set and agreed, reported to the BBC that the response from international colleagues at because he was at a climate action summit, which, funnily enough, Rishi Sunak had declined to attend. That the response from international colleagues was one of consternation. The car maker Kia said that it alters complex supply chain negotiations and product planning, while potentially contributing to consumer and industry confusion. The chief executive of E.ON said that it was a misstep on many levels, and talked about the false argument that the moving to green policies can only come at a cost. Whereas Jaguar Land Rover, who had recently announced actually hundreds of new jobs in the West Midlands,
Yep.
They seem to think that it was a pragmatic change, as did Toyota.
Well, and I think that's where I am. I am wondering about this announcement in terms of whether this is an announcement of a change of policy, or it is in fact a recognition that you were never going to hit it anyway. Because I found the whole electric car discussion and the end of the internal combustion engine for sale, it does throw up so many conundrums in terms of the vehicle owning public. How pragmatic is it to own an electric vehicle? And I think a city like Portsmouth is the kind of perfect example, because we have let's if we focus on what is the one of the most favorite topics to get everybody frothed up in Portsmouth.
Well, you're talking potholes, parking, or poo, aren't you? Dog poo.
Potholes, parking, or poo. And
Yeah.
parking being, we have so many, flat fronted houses that were built before cars were a thing. And so when I look at that and I think about the pragmatic nature of owning an electric vehicle, 7 years to fix that, now 12 years to make that viable. And I know it's not 12 years because there's an element of that's when the new ones aren't being sold and there'll be a phase out of the old ones. But I do wonder how pragmatic in a city like Portsmouth will it be to own a car if you need to charge it electrically?
I don't know. I mean, what was your recent experience like with?
So I still own an electric car. So I went fully electric, and I am going to be giving it back. Not because of its electric nature, it's a long story which I won't bore you with on the podcast. But what I learned was that in terms of owning an electric vehicle. I'm very fortunate. I live in Cosham. I have a hard standing, so I can plug my electric vehicle in overnight to recharge, and it's very, very cheap to run if you can recharge it from your house. To put it into context, my previous BMW cost me about 22p a mile to run, and if I charge my electric overnight, it costs me just over a penny a mile to run. So effectively, all of the round town driving that we do is free. It's not free, but do you know what I mean? It is a handful of copper coins.
Mhm.
But the problem comes when you look further afield, when you have to travel as I do with work. So this week we've got a 250-mile round trip, and the range on my battery is nominally 273 miles. Now, you can't run it that close because it's not like having a petrol car where, you look at it and go, well, we're getting a bit tight. We'll just nip into the petrol station and stick a tenner in. It is a case of you have to plan where you're going to charge your car, and you've got to, you try and plan those stops. But currently, the number of chargers that are available are relatively small in number, and often they're either full with other people charging or they're broken. So you've got the map in your mind that you've thought through, and you say, well, okay, we'll have about 80 miles left when we get there. We'll stop and charge there, and you find that, oh, actually, there's two cars charging. And these things, this is not a nip in the petrol station, stand there for a minute and a half. You've got to plan a 20-minute stop, and you turn up and there are four cars queued up. Well, that either means you're going to be sat about for an hour, or you go on to the next one. So the infrastructure at the moment doesn't feel ready for the number of electric vehicles that there are out there in the wild at the moment. And so I I just am confused as to how we would get to a position where it wouldn't become something that you would have to think about and or plan and or become hugely inconvenienced by.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I mean, interestingly, I mean, there weren't any details released yet, but the PM kind of mentioned something else in his speech about talking about the frustrations with regarding kind of network connections, and therefore kind of how much of an impact that is on kind of slowing things down. But it seems that the argument kind of that the PM was making was about this is imposing a 2030 would have imposed a cost on people that can't afford it, cost of living crisis, the very people that you'd want to be able to actually transition over to EV would be effectively kind of priced out of it. Um,
Mm.
I don't know. I must admit, I'm in kind of two minds about that, because one part of me thinks that with the only way to actually drive, and the pun is entirely intentional, the only way to kind of really drive down the cost of something is to ensure mass adoption, and by removing the point at which new car sales needed to be that type of technology, meant that it means that on one hand, yes, it gives gives installers and network providers and manufacturers a greater period of time, an extra 5 years, in order to kind of arrive at what they need to arrive at. But from a point of view of it driving down the cost to buy a new EV, that's only really going to actually come when actually it becomes a mass adoption thing anyway. But it's also worth not skipping over I think the argument about, well, it's just pricing people out of being able to move over to EVs. But regardless of whether they were EVs, were they people that would have likely have been buying a brand new car anyway? Because the law was never about stopping second-hand car sales or
No,
second user on onward kind of car sales. This was about brand new car sales. So in one hand, the PM's kind of making a point of, well, actually, market forces will again drive that, because in 2016, EV and hybrid car sales were something like 1.6% of new car sales, whereas
Mm.
actually in 2022 they were 23% of new car sales. So,
And
is he looking at that graph and seeing that actually eventually they will naturally be more than 95%, and therefore there won't be a market for petrol driven cars, and therefore people will just stop selling them anyway? So is he
and
moving with that argument?
I think so, Simon, because I think the direction of travel, and I think it showed on that last slide that the majority, are looking, or a significant number of countries are looking at this 2035 deadline, which is where he's moved the goalpost to. Now, there is an element of, again, if you can afford to purchase a new car, and I lease my cars. Um, so there is an element of when you're looking at petrol versus hybrid versus electric, the simple answer is if you do a lot of miles and you can charge, not a ridiculous amount of miles, and you can charge your car at home, then electric actually makes good financial sense because it is so cheap to run. Um, the challenge is that it is still a much more expensive car. When you compare it at the moment to its petrol counterpart. So you do have this situation where the new car market. I think that entry point, it is coming down to your point about market forces. Um, you know some of those original, when you were paying effectively £50,000 for a small family hatchback, when its petrol equivalent was probably £20,000, that gap is narrowing. But I think there is still a piece that says, and it's the bit which I can't get straight in my own mind, which is that when will come, will it actually end up being counterproductive? Because you've got a situation where I don't see how somewhere like Copner, or Buckland could ever be in a position. Buckland's probably a bad idea because car ownership is low there. But how could you possibly ever have a functioning infrastructure that would allow people to effectively charge? Because we're talking about overnight charging. How would they charge their cars overnight? Or their place of work, their car park, would need to have a charging point almost at every space. And I know when I spoke to the head of estates for the organisation I work for and said, "Oi, when are you putting in charging points on all of our sites?" His answer was, "Well, I can't, because I simply can't get the electrical infrastructure to the site to allow me to do that." So I'm this has actually set me thinking much more about, is it going to be a case of the last of the internal combustion engine cars will be nursed and loved and the prices kept high because all the time you're allowed to, rather than driving maybe a 3-year-old car, you're going to keep driving a 10-year-old petrol electric car in 2045 because you've still got no way to to charge that car effectively.
Well, I think there's several barriers there, and originally when we discussed this episode, we'd wanted to get someone from the EV charging industry
Mm,
on, and we wanted to get someone on that thought it was a great idea, and someone that didn't think this delay was a great idea, and talk kind of around those points. But unfortunately, we weren't able to secure all of the guests, so we decided it was best just to have a editorial episode where we would talk it through ourselves rather than just have one guest who was taking one point of view, and
yes.
then us trying for purposes of conversation to kind of thrash out the others. But I think there are practical elements about that. So from a perspective of, if you're managing a project and there are particular pinch points in your delivery of that project, and still that you can't change actually the overarching end point of delivery, But there are some milestones that you can move along the way. Essentially, that's what Sunak's done, isn't it?
Mm.
He's moved these milestones. It was interesting that that Jaguar Land Rover, having last week or whenever it was, saying said themselves that they were going to invest loads of money in basically an EV factory, that they weren't then bruised by this announcement. So in some respects, if yeah, I can get that the car manufacturing industry, the only potential, if you think from an economy perspective, benefit, and here I am trying to play devil's advocate,
Mm.
is that was there any industry benefit of going 5 years ahead of the EU? Because in that respect, would that mean that manufacturers could potentially have chosen the UK as a site on which to manufacture their cars, or at least manufacture a large at least a part of their vehicles that they were then assembled in the EU, so they didn't have import taxes or whatever. However, that arrangement would have meant, would it have been a shoe in that would have got the UK to a point where we became a natural place for that investment to take place, because we were moving 5 years earlier than the rest of the continent. That was maybe that was kind of an argument for that, but Jaguar Land Rover's response doesn't seem to
No, and
kind of kind of back that up. So I
well,
think there's sorry, go on.
well, I think the car makers are an interesting bunch, aren't they? Because there is an element of their job is to sell the public cars,
Mm.
and there is an element of that they've got a very clear, 3035 is a clear direction of travel, and there's an element of you know that change that you described in 7 years from sort of, what was it, 1-2% to 23%, says that the tide is heading that way anyway. I think there is this piece where if you know if the models that you're bringing through are fully electric and or hybrid, then I think you've got a very strong sales pitch to sell those cars. Because I think there is an element of, and this is where it's interesting to understand what the public perception of this is. There are people who, if the product is good enough and the person buying the product thinks, well, quote unquote, I'm doing my bit, then given the choice between a petrol, a diesel, or a hybrid or an electric, I think people are naturally going to self-select towards the hybrid or the electric if they can make that work for them.
Well, I mean, there's that side of the argument. Um, I just think that you know I can't help but keep coming back to the actually, if the law requiring that, basically saying that you had to stop selling internal combustion engine vehicles, means that everyone has to do it. You are then forcing the industry wholesale to change, and therefore all of the new vehicles. If that's, it's almost like it doesn't. It almost contradicts itself in that way, because actually, if in the space of those 7 years we've gone from 1.6% to 23%, and therefore in the next 7 years, are we going to basically go from that 23% up to 100%, or probably 90-95%? Quite probably. In which case, why move it back?
Well, because I think there is this element of, and that's where I think this tipping point comes, Simon, which is that the infrastructure can't cope, and there will be that piece, and if you, as we did before deciding to go for the fully electric, you kind of look at the blogs and you look at the noise online about owning an electric vehicle. There are stories that you will have read that would have put you off from ever owning one. There is an element of, there are people who have had very bad experiences owning electric cars. Um, Mine has not been great, but that's more to do with the car than its electric nature.
Yeah, I think there's kind of and again with the puns, there's lots of moving parts to this. it's a bit kind of catch-22. On one hand, either we're heading in that direction, in which case why delay it, or is delaying it. So I don't know. Falling into line with where everyone else is again means that we get to take advantage of investment that's elsewhere, and movements of kind of mass production that delivers that elsewhere. So I don't know. I must admit I'm in two minds. Personally, I think that the sooner we move away from using any form of fossil fuels, the better, because net zero is merely about the point at which you stop making it worse, and we're already careering towards a point, and we can already see the effects of climate change and what they're having. And I think the cost of not doing enough is going to be greater than the cost of actually doing that now. So I mean, one of our friends of the pod, their comment that they made was that it's his claims that neither. So this was from Elliot. The PM's claims that neither people nor the economy can afford to act to prevent the full impact of the climate crisis are ridiculous. We can afford to act, otherwise the problem is just going to build up, becoming a greater financial and social burden for future generations to deal with. A pause on commitments would feel somewhat like a decision a sensible government would make, but to roll back makes you question their intentions. And
Well,
we could. Sorry, there was just another paragraph. So fossil fuels are so expensive. What would be useful right now is the financial support to make that transition, so that over time they can move away from oil and gas. We know that renewables are cheaper. We know that energy efficiency is cheaper. The energy we don't need to use is the cheapest of all. So I mean that's a very, very interesting point. We're
so
talking about all of that. Sorry, go on.
there's some really good points in there, but I
Mm.
think one of the difficulties in this whole discussion is around the idealism versus the reality, and it is that we as a society can't afford not to get that, but there's an element of, you know, and again, let me paint a little picture. You know, we're a family of four living in Copner. There's nowhere for us to charge our electric cars. We both work long shifts. We're not, we're earning below the average wage. Well, in 2031, when my boiler breaks, it would have been 4 grand to replace that with a gas boiler. And as a household, that would have been really tough for us to find 4 grand. But we can't have no hot water and no heating, so we're going to have to find the 4 grand from somewhere. I'm not sure where we're going to find 11 grand, 12 grand for a heat pump. And that's where I think Elliot's Elliot's idealism in that post, where it slightly runs aground, because I think we can all agree that it would be better if, and I think we're all on that same page. But I think there is a piece that the difference in cost between a heat pump and a gas boiler is 2x, 3x, and the difference between an electric car and a non-electric car is 1.5x. And when money is tight, and let's look at it, the irrespective of who's running the country, there's a really big bill to pay, and the economic forecast for the next 10 years doesn't look spectacular. That's where I start to look at these decisions through the lens of pragmatism, and how responsible is it for a government to force those kind of costs onto its folk, even though morally it's probably the right thing to do.
Um, yeah, but those aren't the only. I mean, I guess the overarching point is those aren't the only choices, are they? And there are other choices that can be made to again invest in technology, or to subsidise the installation, indeed to subsidise the insulation of
Yep.
of properties. So I think probably where some of the greatest struggle is in more rural areas where they're off gas network,
Yep.
where they're using oil fired boilers. So there'll be places where the householder would essentially have a tank on their property that they'll get filled up
Yep.
from time to time, because they're basically just not on the gas network, and therefore that's the only way they can heat their home. Um, the alternative to replace that with something that's powered with electricity, a heat pump, unless you're generating and storing that electricity on site. So unless you've got lots of solar array, wind turbine, and lots of battery storage on site, the alternatives to doing that electrically, the alternatives by
Yeah.
doing that electrically would you're talking about substantial upgrades both to the property and to the network around them, in order to basically take that amount of power to a quiet squeaky little village, where there's one property on a hill or whatever. So
Hmm.
so there's an argument there, but then again you could also say that, okay, we exempt properties in a rural area. You could say we exempt properties that aren't going to be served by, basically, that have to wait more than a given period for an electricity connection that's going to be able to do it. So although it's not the final, it's not the ideal solution, you don't have to have an all or nothing answer, because net zero isn't stopping all burning of fossil fuels. It's saying all of the burning of fossil fuels that still takes place is offset by some form of carbon or other greenhouse gas capture.
Yep. Yep.
So, and those properties by volume and by quantity aren't really going to be that much of a contribution to the overall greenhouse gas contributions from the UK.
Yeah.
I think there's a bit of me that kind of thinks that there's a false argument either way to say that actually the answers have to be binary.
And I think that's a really good point, because it is about the banning of, and it's about, and that's where I'm less worried about the rural side of things, simply because those properties will be fewer in number. I think where I start to get a bit nervous, it's a little bit like my concern with the electric car, is, when you start looking at high density housing, social housing, rented housing, we one of the things that I think we can all agree on is that, the cost of putting a roof over your head is just extraordinarily high, and it's the shortage of affordable property is something we've discussed on the podcast many times before. um and that, that is a real issue for us. And I just look at, the cost of a heat pump to be installed. You kind of look at it and think, well, you do worry about, kind of, well, are we going to be in a situation where, almost, if it's, we talk about no gas boiler, are we going to be going back to, immersion heaters and electric, whatever they, what were the things, the radiators with bricks in, that storage
Storage heaters.
heaters? Are we going to be headed back that way? Simply because, which were, although electrically powered, were hugely inefficient, simply because the capital cost of installing them is lower than putting in a heat pump.
Possibly. I mean that. Yeah. I mean it's true that those are the options. I mean, the whole point of that. I mean, some of this actually thinks about, when you think about in the 70s, those were a choice, because overnight, when demand on the network was very, very low, it's actually, if you've got for example, a coal-fired power station, you don't really want to shut it down overnight. You actually just
Nope.
keep it running. So what you want to do is get have some way to use all of that extra electricity. So what seemed to be the thing in the 70s was flog that electricity off at cheap rate. But we've got different technologies, and people have got smart meters and things like that now. That
Well,
means that all of those things are different, and I couldn't kind of speak to kind of how those works, but the technological solutions to those things are slightly different. So again, it isn't a heat pump is the only way of heating a home. There's more than one technology to heat by electricity, and there's more than one way to make sure that a property can make use of cheap rate electricity.
and
And
that's exactly how my EV charger works.
yeah,
And again, it's all slightly surreal in that it gets plugged in and we've set it up on the app, and at 1 minute past midnight, it turns itself on and it slurps from the electricity supply until 4:59 in the morning when it turns itself off. And as I say, the difference in terms of the cost of that electricity is 20% of the cost that it would be if I did the same charging during the day, and um, it is kind of 50 times cheaper than the cost of the electricity if I was to go and plug my car in at a commercial um, recharging point that's out in the wild. So I think there is a situation where in all of this, 2050 hasn't moved. 2030, the delay 2030 to 2035. I think there's a bit of me just having researched it, because we do a bit of research sometimes for the podcast. I'm not convinced it wasn't inevitable. So I guess the interesting question is the is the calling of it now the honest call by the project manager who knows that they're not going to hit the end deadline, or surely if it's a really bad thing that Rishi has done this week, shouldn't he have left it for whoever the next incumbent is to sit in number 10,
Whoever that might be.
to open the project plan up and think, oh my God, we're not going to hit that. I'm now going to have to announce the delay.
Yeah, politically that's an interesting thing. So it's hard to tell between, because some of the things that were in the speech, we won't dwell on them, but were quite clear. I mean, we've kind of looked at the slides, but some of the things were stuff that was, I've stopped these things happening, that were not things that were ever going to happen. Were not things that the government had agreed to actually put into place. Sorry?
7 bins have come from Rishi.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
7 bin Sunak. So it's a strange kind of narrative to take and also kind of label as, I want to be honest with you, but I'm going to start my speech by making actually 4 very untrue claims. But yeah, it's hard to know between that whether the motivation is political or basically just pragmatic understanding, and in which case, why at this point, why a couple of days after Liz Truss made her speech and a week ahead of the Conservative Party conference, why make this announcement now? I don't know, and it's the thing that worries me, if whether this is red meat to the people in certain political parties that may or may not be climate change deniers, that basically just want all of this net zero. I think some of them are quoted of using different words to describe net zero, and that we should just get rid of all of this green quote unquote crap. Is that just kind of red meat to them to kind of get them off of his back? I don't know.
Well,
obviously I'm not sat in that room, but an indication for me would be the stuff that's happened since, which seems to be a wanting to position themselves of, so it's almost like a bit like the Republican Party in the US. They're trying to make sure that everybody understands that they're the party of liberty and they're the party of free choice, and we want to protect your guns. They're coming for your guns, despite there actually being no evidence of them coming for their guns. We obviously don't have a gun, guns widely available in the UK, so it's not kind of something, but something people do have a personal and emotional attachment to is that block of metal that they pay a lot of money for, that spends 95% of its time unoccupied, sat doing nothing but depreciating. And it seems that the tactic is the government to put itself on the side of car owners.
Yep.
When you see the stuff about the 20 miles an hour stuff that they've come up with since,
ending the war on motorists.
Yeah, and it's this whole kind of thing of, when you look at that in context, I don't know, that makes me feel quite uneasy, if I'm really honest. In one sense, there's a bit of me that could say, okay, if this was the pragmatic decision of what you needed to do because otherwise you weren't going to make the decision now. But in any situation, if your project owner has said, well, we're not going to change our end target, but we're going to move these milestones. Usually, what they'd turn around and say is, what are you going to do to make sure that in 2 years' time we're not having the same conversation and we are going to be on track for this new milestone that we've set? And also, what are you doing to alleviate the squeezing of the milestone, basically the journey to the next milestone from
Yep.
this one that you've just kind of moved down the timeline? Um, is that just kicking the can down the road? And will we have another conversation in 2 years' time where that happens? Has he just given a free pass to Starmer, where Starmer can say, well, we're not going to bring it back to 2030 because we don't want to mess investment and mess the industry around again. So he's essentially just given Keir Starmer another 5 years to sort a problem that Rishi Sunak has created. But I don't know. I just find it interesting, the differing voices that you've got coming out of the quote unquote leadership of the Conservative Party. The differing wings of it. It's got more wings than a dragonfly, I think, at this point. That as to we should be going for this and investing in it because it's a future for our economy and it's the right thing to do for our country and our planet. And as Elliot said, the cheapest energy is the energy you don't have to use. So these are all the things we should be going hell for leather in and actually investing in our own people. But I don't know. I feel at the moment like it's just kicking the can down the road and either hoping that there's some sort of miraculous technological solution, which we've seen how well that works in other things over the last 7 years, or hoping that someone else will just have to deal with it and it won't be him, because even if the Conservatives win the next election, it's not likely to be him that's around that long.
No, so, I think as I touched on at the start, I think it is a positioning of the Conservative Party for the next election. I think we have to look at the Uxbridge by-election. Yeah. I think we have to look at the tipping point within that election. Almost every political commentator acknowledges that ULEZ played a part in that, and that it was the unpopularity of ULEZ coming to. Oh, if you pressed a button.
Yeah, I did. Sorry, I was trying something. Go
don't do that again. There's an element of ULEZ coming to Uxbridge was the tipping point that meant the Conservatives kept that seat against all odds. So I am looking, as we do as observers of the political landscape, I am not convinced that there is a piece going on now, which is that I think against the backdrop of a increasing cost of living and the just the general expenses, I think when people look at what is the right thing to do, but what will be the personal cost to them. We've discussed it on Portsmouth with cars before, haven't we? Everybody thinks there should be less cars on the island. Everyone thinks that somebody else should give their car up because there's not room for all of them. The concept that you might be the person to give the car up is where everything tends to hit a stumbling block. So I think there is a bit of political positioning here that and again, you can argue morally where it comes from, but I think it is a statement about these things. I think they're very popular with people who are very invested in sort of climate change and would consider themselves to be green, and I put that in air quotes. I think for people who want to do their bit, I think they'll self-select anyway, but I think it will be a popular move with the person on the street to say, well, we're not going to impose this expense on you, and effectively will dare the Labour Party now to say, oh yes, we're going to, or to hang with it.
Yeah, it's a disappointing type of political brinksmanship when actually what's at risk is the environmental future, and I know this is quite a hyperbolic point, but when what's actually at risk is actually the future of the planet. I don't think our children's children are going to thank us for pissing away the possibility of kind of moving forward by arguing about whether or not we could take some of the take the subsidy away from fossil fuel investments, and tax those unwelcome profits that have happened because of the increases in oil because of the Ukraine war, because of Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and invest those in actually bringing down bills and actually bringing down costs of energy for the households, that especially those that need it, by increasing their insulation and by solving some of the problems about the installation of kind of charging points. Yeah, we're not the only city that's going to face the problem of how do you fit in charging points in loads of rows and rows of flat fronted properties. And in fact, there are actually many differing solutions that work, from having the charge points in lampposts, which is something I think that's been pushed forward in Portsmouth, to, not be funny, quite literally actually running a cable in essentially what's a gutter from the property to the street, so that you can kind of do it that way. You know, all of those things can be fixed, but they are all political choices, and I think it's a shame that all of those things, rather than just problems that need to be solved, are actually being used as barriers to actually do it. But I think you're right that some of this is the lesson that the government have learned from the result of the Uxbridge by-election, and they've found a wedge issue that they're going to use to try and win the next general election.
They've got to find something, Simon. They're not ready to give it up quite yet, and
no,
and I think that's where, as we get into conference season, it's going to be interesting, isn't it? The Conservatives have got theirs this weekend. I think it's Labour next weekend.
Yes, yeah.
So I think that's where, as political pundits, we will wait and see. The Conservatives have set out their stall as the champion of the motorist, and we'll have a look next weekend and see.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see
where Labour go.
From, is it Manchester or Birmingham they're in? They're going to talk, whether they're going to talk about cancelling another leg of HS2. At this point, it's not going to get very far outside of London, but it'll be interesting to see what happens to the polls, because the Conservatives have recently started to, or whether that's a blip or not, will time be seen. But they've closed the gap between them and Labour. Can they, what will happen? Because normally parties actually have a poll bump when they have their conference week.
Yep.
So what will that do to them? And indeed, will that become a staging point for them to kind of fight a battle on, or will Labour do enough in their conference to be able to regain that gap? Who knows?
Who knows? Time is upon us, and so we won't go into HS3, my campaign for a high-speed link between London and Portsmouth. We'll leave that for another show. You've been listening to the Pompey Politics Podcast. I've been Ian Tiny Morris.
And I've been Simon Sansbury, and do make sure to join us next week, where we have the first of our ward reports, where we're going to be speaking to the Paulsgrove ward councillors, and the following week we're going to be speaking to Portsmouth's Lord Mayor. So do indeed join us next week at 6:27, where hopefully we'll have the audio also working, and we'll see you then.